You should know that the piece that Catherine and Sissy just sang, as well as the anthem, are among hundreds of pieces written and composed by Natalie Wakely-Sleeth, who grew up in this congregation, whose final resting place is in the Memorial Garden, and who was a member of the Joseph Sears class of 1944. This is the fourth of 5 sermons presented with the confirmation class in mind. It relates to their studies. The second lesson is taken from the first book of the Kings, the 19th chapter. Elijah got up and drank and ate, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. The word of the Lord came to him in that cave, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets. And I alone am left, and they are seeking my life." God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of sheer silence. When was the last time you experienced the sound of sheer silence? In the course of preparing these thoughts, the doorbell rang. At 7:47 on the way to O'Hare buzzed me. Our grand dog began to bark. The telephone interrupted several times. A door slammed somewhere out there. And all the while, my computer contentedly provided a background hum. I have a contented computer. We almost never experience silence. We may have many times when no one else is physically present to us, but we are rarely without somebody talking to us. If not by telephone, then that ubiquitous television set. Guess what studies show Americans turn on almost automatically whenever they enter a room? We are connected to external voices and noises to the point where we can scarcely tolerate silence and solitude. One young woman told me with a straight face that she cannot start her car until she has turned the radio on. Indeed. In fact, we've become a culture a bit suspicious of silence and solitude, which wonders about people who say that they like to be alone, which looks upon stillness as craziness. In her book many years ago, Gift from the Sea, Anne Murrow Lindbergh wrote, "The world today does not understand in either man or woman the need to be alone. Anything else will be accepted as an excuse. If one sets aside time for a business appointment, a trip to the hairdresser, a social engagement, that excuse will be accepted quite naturally. But if one says, 'I'm sorry I can't come because that's my time to be alone,' one is considered rude, egotistical, or more likely a little bit strange." What a commentary on our civilization when being alone and quiet is considered suspect, when one has to make excuses, hide the fact that one practices it as if it were a secret vice. Some of our institutions are learning, at least a young man tells me that IBM has encouraged its executives to get off by themselves a bit because they've discovered it improves their efficiency. This young man says he even saw one of them on the golf course where he plays, at the club where he plays. He did notice that in the golf cart this fellow had a laptop, a fax machine, and a cellular telephone. So the question is whether we have not been caught up in a culture and a lifestyle where we miss a very precious gift. In her new book, 50 Days of Solitude, Doris Grumbach recounts the experience of that many days of self-inflicted time alone without company or telephone up on the Maine coast in winter. And she tells how difficult an experience it really was. A native New Yorker who in her 75 years has been a student, a wave, a wife, a mother, a literary critic, a novelist, and a teacher. She'd lived alone for only 2 short periods, once when her husband went off to World War II, and then once a decade later when they separated. In the end, she concludes that she learned she needs to live as if dressed for a Maine winter, in layers, with the top layer of my person known to the outside world and important in relationships, but close to the bone. She discovered there had to be an inner stratum, formed and cultivated in solitude, where the essence of what I was and am and will be for the rest of my days hides itself and waits to be found by me in solitude, in silence. I'm convinced that one of the reasons we tend to be a lonely people in this day and age is not the absence of relationships or company, but because we have seldom learned to be productively and comfortably alone with ourselves. Susan Jones comments, what a miraculous power silence and solitude holds. We were born with 2 ears and 1 mouth. Maybe God was trying to tell us something. Young people tell me that the major impact of their outward bound experience, the most transforming impact, is that last 24 hours that they are forced to spend alone, without television or telephone or contact with the outside world. So perhaps it ought not to surprise us that the great figures of faith learned and grew in times spent cut off from the crowd, in the silence and solitude of the sea or the mountain or even the temple. The burning bush happens to Moses, tending sheep on the mountainside. Isaiah is alone in the mysterious dark of the temple when God and mission enter his life. Jesus finds his direction in life during 40 days in the wilderness alone. The thought of spending 40 days all alone anywhere, let alone in the wilderness, is to me an almost impossible prospect. And then there's Elijah in a cave on Sinai, all alone, when Ahab, king of Israel, had married the pagan princess Jezebel and had brought her from Lebanon. She had imported her own religion. She brought several hundred Baalist priests, and they had set up shop in Israel, pushing their somewhat looser god. Elijah is enraged, and he engages them in a contest on the heights of Mount Carmel, and he wins hands down. When their God does not show, they are humiliated. And when Elijah's God shows, he rains down earthquake, wind, and fire, devouring everything in his path. And the whole nation roars its approval, and Elijah is an overnight celebrity on every talk show going. It's a great day of great triumph. But unfortunately, Jezebel is unimpressed. And she sends a fax to the prophet telling him that when she gets her hands on him, he's a dead man. So Elijah turns from hero into coward, and he runs for 40 days and 40 nights down the Jordan Valley into the Sahara Desert. You have to be pretty scared to run for 40 days and 40 nights down the Jordan Valley. To hide in a cave on Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, where again there is earthquake and wind and fire, but he knows his God only in the sheer sound of silence. David Holler, in his marvelous little book of interviews with children entitled Just Build the Ark and the Animals Will Show, received this response from Adam, age 7, when Holler asked him, judging from the Old Testament, how do you think God communicates with us? And Adam replied, well, he used to do it through storms, but I think he's gotten a lot quieter. But even as early as Elijah, he is not known in the storm, but in the stillness. And could it be that God is really not very real to us because we can't hear him over the earthquake, wind, and fire, the chatter of Oprah Winfrey, or the cheers of the stadium, or the roar of the commuter train, or the beat of the Walkman? Perhaps we don't hear from God very much anymore because our lives are never reduced to real silence. The man says to his woman, dear, is there anything you'd like to say before football season begins? But what does it mean to take time and quiet to hear God? Are we really expecting an auditory experience, a Charlton Heston voice out of the skies? I forget who said it, but silence, time with God, really means thinking alone with and from and before him, with all that that does for us and to us. And I think the first thing it does is give perspective. Wallowing in self-pity, Elijah moans, the whole world out there has gone to the dogs, and I'm the only one left who cares. But in the silence, he senses a word saying, sorry, Elijah, not true. There are 9,000 out there who feel the same way you do. Little different perspective on reality. Time alone is time where we back off and get some distance from life and begin to sense the way things really are, and also what is important and what is not, what is critical to a life well lived and what is not. It's a matter of deciding what is of consequence and worth worrying about and what in the long run is pretty trivial and passing. Part of the problem of life caught up in continual and obsessive activity, and isn't most of ours, constantly bumping elbows, continually battered by external stimuli, mad or melodic, is that everything begins to take on equal urgency, and that wears us down quicker than anything. Let me tell you the truth. There are people whose opinion of you really is not all that important. There are possessions you can really do without quite nicely. There are goals you do not need to achieve in order to be outrageously happy. There are places that you do not have to see before you die, although I'm working on that one. Life is full of unimportant things, and when we get too invested and too obsessed all across the board, we destroy our efficiency and we obliterate all serenity of spirit. One good way to think about the demands upon you in that quiet moment is to ask what difference it's all going to make in 10 years. Young people, you are worried now about whether that boy or girl will like you. I tell you, 10 years from now, you won't even remember being worried. Tug McGraw had a wonderful philosophy of pitching, his frozen snowball theory. He said, if I come into pitch with the bases loaded and Willie Stargell is at bat, there is no rational reason I would want to throw the ball. As long as I hold on to it, nothing bad can happen to me. But I'm also aware that eventually I have to throw it. So I remind myself that in a few billion years, the sun is going to burn out and the earth will become a frozen snowball hurtling through space. And when that happens, nobody's going to care what Willie Stargell did with the bases loaded. Another good way to sort out what is really worthwhile and what you can relegate to another day is to ask what kind of an epitaph you would like for your life. What would you put on the tombstone that would kind of sum up what was important in your life? I love wandering around the old cemeteries out east where they still put more than the name on them. In fact, I got a file of epitaphs, most of which I suspect never hit a tombstone. Like, Martha, I told you I was sick. She lived with her husband 50 years and died in a confident hope of a better life. Or there's the woman who engraved on her husband's tombstone 2 sentences, rest in peace until we meet again. But young people, I've never found a tombstone that had written on it SAT score 1100. Or I was a member of Mensa, or for that matter, CEO. Do you know, I've not been able to discover one CEO in Memorial Park, at least not by reading the rocks. What do you read? Unfortunately, I have to spend a certain amount of time in cemeteries. You read things like beloved father, beloved husband, beloved wife. I'll bet there are a lot of things you are overly concerned about this day that are not important enough to carve into stone. Beverly Sills is a woman whose life has been laced with disappointment and tragedy. In an interview, she was asked how she copes with all the disappointment in her life, having been snubbed by the musical establishment in New York City for years, and above all, the tragedy of having a child born deaf, who therefore could never hear her mother's magnificent voice. How did she make it? She talks about what she calls stillness. This is what she says. It really doesn't come to you perhaps until you're a mature human being, and I think that no matter what your work is, when it does descend, it changes everything. It isn't that you feel you are more important than everybody else, and therefore their opinion ought not to count. It's simply that you realize it is not important if everybody doesn't love you. It is more important for you to love. It turns your whole perspective around. Perspective. And then I think purpose, you need to get alone and quiet from time to revive some sense of purpose that gets so eroded in the daily details of one darn thing after another. Elijah comes out of that sheer silence with a new sense of mission. He hears God say in the sheer silence, go. Jesus goes off into the barren silence of the wilderness in order to find the mission his life shall take, to become clear of his purpose under God. Life on the run so easily loses its sense of direction and focus. Like the famous general of whom it was said, he mounted up and rode off in all directions. That's the way a lot of us hit the day, isn't it? The word burnout has become one of the buzzwords of our time. Ministers burn out, teachers burn out, business executives burn out, mothers burn out. What's the problem? The problem is not too much activity. Burnout does not occur because we work too hard. Burnout happens when hard workers lose their sense of mission. That's when the work gets to you, drags you down. Dr. Raymond B. Flannery Jr. is assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. He writes, "Who are the stress-resistant people?" I became interested in this question as the result of some personal observations. One Saturday evening, after I myself had spent a frazzling day working with stressed-out people in a walk-in clinic, I turned to a nurse who had also worked the whole day with me and said something like, "Everybody and his brother went through here today." She looked at me and said, "You know better than that. Some people never come here." And I started to wonder what those people are like. What do you think he discovered? Those with the least illness were those who were personally committed to a goal, a mission of some kind. Might have been completing college, or building a new business, or becoming a better parent, or advancing a community service. But in every case, these people were doing something that provided a sense of challenge and enhanced their sense of meaningful participation in life. And what are the goals you've got out there in the next 12 months that grab you and excite you and organize you and give your life focus and direction? Every one of us ought to go into our cave once in a while to listen in sheer silence for the reason for our being here, in order to hear the word go. Perspective, purpose, power, energy. One reason for our depletion is that we do not take the time to receive, to let new spirit and energy arise from the unconscious springs of God's Spirit. I can witness, as well as anybody, that it is when I neglect the solitude of quiet and receptive waiting, when I get too busy to go apart and shut down, that the Spirit grows weak in me. They who wait renew their strength, run and are not weary, walk and do not faint. Out of the solitude and silence of his blindness, John Milton brought Paradise Lost. From the solitude and silence of prison cells came John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, Oscar Wilde's Best Tune, Letters and Papers from Prison by Bonhoeffer. In fact, the last letter that Maria von Wedemeyer got from Dietrich Bonhoeffer before he was hanged by the Nazis reads interestingly like this: "It is as though in solitude the soul develops senses and strength which we hardly know in everyday life. Therefore, I have not felt lonely or abandoned for one moment. You must not think that I am unhappy. What is happiness and unhappiness? It depends so little on our circumstance. It depends only on what goes on inside." Or finally, let me use the example of one of my distant mentors, Harry Emerson Fosdick, one of the great preachers of America at Riverside Church, New York City. But as a seminary student, he suffered a complete physical and emotional breakdown which led to a suicide attempt. Later in his biography, The Living of These Days, he writes, "For the first time I faced at my wit's end a situation too much for me to handle. I went down into the depths where self-confidence became ludicrous. And there the techniques that I had habitually relied upon, marshaling my wit and my will and going strenuously after what I wanted, failed me completely. The harder I struggled, the worse I was. I, who had thought myself so strong, found myself beaten, unable to cope, not only with outward circumstances, but with myself as well. In that experience, I learned some things about religion that seminaries do not teach. I learned to pray, not because I had adequately argued out prayer's rationality to my satisfaction, but simply because I desperately needed help from God. And I learned that God, much more than a theological proposition, is an available presence and strength. That just as around our bodies there is a physical universe from which we draw our physical energy, so around our spirits is a spiritual presence in which we can find sustaining strength. When I am weak, when I'm at the end of my resources, done for, where self-confidence is ludicrous, I find I can be strong." And out of that experience, Fosdick penned this little prayer. "O God, in restless living, we lose our spirit's peace. Calm our unwise confusion. Bid thou our clamor cease. Let anxious hearts grow quiet like pools at evening, still, till thy reflected heavens all our spirits fill. Teach us beyond our striving the rich rewards of rest. Who does not live serenely is never deeply blessed. O tranquil, radiant sunlight, bring thou our lives to flower, less wearied with our own effort, more filled with thine own power." So let us take a prayer like that and go find our cave again.